The significance of the Washington Monument really needs no explanation now, but there are just a few details to fill in. On July 4th, 1848, the cornerstone of this monument was laid by Benjamin B. French, Grand Master of the Grand Lodge of the District of Columbia, as part of a Masonic ceremony. Hundreds of lodges contributed to the building of the monument, which contains 35 Masonic memorial stones interspersed with the rest. The numbers involved are quite intriguing with the Washington Monument. At the ground level, each side of the monument measures 55.5 feet, which is 666 inches exactly. The height of the obelisk is 555.5 feet, which is 6,666 inches. There are other more complicated numbers and combinations of numbers that are often centered on the number 13, also concealed within this structure. I won't go into them all individually, but in Chaldean numerology the number 13 represented a number indicating change of plans, place, and such like, and is not unfortunate as is generally supposed. In some of the ancient writings it is said, "He who understands the number 13 will be given power and dominion." It is a symbol of power which, if wrongly used, will wreak destruction upon oneself. It is a number of warning of the unknown or unexpected if it becomes a compound number in one's calculations. So the numbers themselves convey a message to the initiated. In this case it's saying that America represents a change of plan and location, which would mean the change away from France, and that it will be a country of great power. The Statue of Liberty is perhaps the most recognizable American landmark. Indeed, she is almost synonymous with the USA. It is quite widely known that the statue is a gift from France to America, but the details of the structure give the game away. The gift was in fact from the French Grand Orient Temple Masons to the Masons of America, in celebration of the centenary of the First Masonic Republic in 1884. It was commissioned by the French Mason Edward Le Bouillet, who wanted to create a giant statue replicating a goddess that the Masonic movement idolized. Le Bouillet was responsible for raising the finances necessary for the project and commissioned fellow Mason Frederick Bartholdi to produce the designs for the sculpture. It was then built by Gustave Eiffel, also a Freemason, who would sculpt this goddess of illumination from ancient times, the same goddess they had enthroned at Notre Dame. The Statue of Liberty remains the biggest idol of the goddess Asherah in the world today. Her name there is the Roman Libertas. Some who have recognized the Masonic link call her by her Egyptian name Isis. Really, it doesn't matter what name she's given, it's the same goddess from Babylon. Libertas in ancient Rome was the goddess of personal freedom and liberty, and was popular for her promotion of the idea that people should be free to do whatever feels good. She was called the matron goddess of prostitution because she promoted sexual freedom. Indeed, according to the Roman system, she had invented the concept. This isn't surprising when we remember that Semiramis was a brothel keeper. Different name, same characteristics as always. Slaves considered her their goddess as well, as they looked to her as their hope for freedom. Many female slaves who gained their freedom later turned to prostitution to survive, and thereby retained Libertas as their goddess. The Statue of Liberty holds in her right hand the Masonic Torch of Enlightenment, and her official title is Liberty Enlightening the World. Her pose is actually quite similar to that of Baphomet again. The cornerstone of the monument was laid with full Masonic ceremony, and the base contains a plaque dedicated to the Freemasons of New York. The crown of 7 spikes represents the enlightenment of the sun god. The idea was that the illumination could be focused down each of the 7 spikes, which would radiate to the 7 main land masses or continents of the world. The statue was originally to be made in colour, and her robes would be purple and scarlet, which would align her with the prostitute woman in Revelation. This idea was later abandoned when it became clear the statue would need to be built from copper due to financial constraints. It has also been suggested that the sculptor, Bartholdi, had originally designed an effigy of Isis for the opening of the Suez Canal in Egypt in 1867. When it was rejected for that initial purpose, he merely adapted it slightly as the gift for New York Harbor. The Statue of Liberty is not just the largest idol of Asherah, it is the largest idol ever made by human hands, and beats the previous record holder, the Colossus of Rhodes, into a distant second place. Now this is the American $1 bill, one of the most recognizable and iconic pieces of currency in the world. It is packed with Masonic symbolism. You will see two circles containing unusual images. The one on the left now needs little explanation if you've been following this series from the start, but we can unpack it a little bit more. The Latin surrounding the all-seeing eye reads, Annuit coeptis novus ordo seclorum. This means announcing the birth of the New World Order. The occult agenda is to see the whole world come under a global system of governance, and the designers of the Great Seal here clearly saw that the Masons in America would make it a key player in the birth of that New World Order. Coincidentally, a form of inverted pentagram spelling out the word Mason can be found by connecting the first and last letters of some of the words together. There are also multiples of the number 13 in the dollar bill. For example, there are 13 layers in the pyramid. I'm just speculating here, but because there are believed to be 13 Illuminati family bloodlines in the world today, this could mean that these 13 families of power are the ones constructing the foundations upon which the capstone, Lucifer, or the Antichrist will come. The symbol on the right has just as much esoteric symbolism. Manly P. Hall writes, European mysticism was not dead at the time the United States of America was founded. The hand of the mysteries controlled in the establishment of the new government for the signature of the mysteries may still be seen on the Great Seal of the United States of America. Careful analysis of the seal discloses a mass of occult and Masonic symbols, chief among them the so-called American Eagle. The American Eagle upon the Great Seal is but a conventionalized phoenix. The phoenix from the flames is basically the order out of chaos motif, the idea that out of the flames of war and pain and chaos comes an end which has justified the means. You might remember it from the front of Albert Pike's book, Morals and Dogma. Now this American bird has 13 leaves in the olive branch in its left claw, 13 bars and stripes in the shield, 13 arrows in its right claw, a ribbon saying E pluribus unum, which as we know means out of many one, and this has 13 letters, 13 stars in the crest above his head, and these stars create a hexagram. Again, the hexagram has 6 points, 6 angles, and 6 planes, so it represents the number 666. It is used to invoke Satan and can be considered to be the most wicked symbol in the world. Finally, the right wing on the bird has 32 feathers and the left has 33, which represents the degrees of Freemasonry. Now finally in this part we'll look at the Washington DC street layout. Now here we have a satellite view of the center of Washington DC. We will notice certain things about it if we study it in detail. The first thing is that the street layout creates an inverted pentagram, with the southern point being the White House. However, notice that the Washington Monument obelisk does not align with the White House. Instead it aligns with what lies behind the White House, the Supreme Council Masonic Temple. The decision to build along this line shows that the Masons believe the real power of the United States doesn't lie with the temporal president, but with the spiritual power they perceive to be behind the president. We have already noted the significance of the Washington Monument in relation to the Capitol, and how the two are meant to generate a kind of spiritual energy. If we connect it to the Lincoln Memorial at the other side, we get an inverted Tau symbol. The Tau symbol represents Tammuz, and in astrology the Taurus bull, both of which point to it being a symbol for Baal. Draw a line from the US Capitol and the Lincoln Memorial up to the Masonic Temple, and you create a triangle or pyramid style shape with the temple as the capstone, the place where the all-seeing eye would be. This once more represents the power of the fraternity. Finally, I'm more skeptical of this one, but it's been suggested that if we connect the White House to the Capitol and then down to the Jefferson Memorial, we can also make out a compass and square as shown in the photo. If we zoom in on the Capitol again from the air, we see this shape which resembles an owl. Owls are significant because they represent wisdom. In Greece, the goddess of wisdom was called Athena, and she was associated with owls. Wise old owls are common in many other stories and in ancient mythologies. In virtually every Disney movie near a forest there will be a wise owl to lend a hand. You often see them also wearing glasses and surrounded by books. The reason for this association is that owls are nocturnal creatures who can see in the dark. Being able to see things no one else can see is a metaphor for the occultist. The owl combines the ideas of knowledge and enlightenment. The owl symbol also brings us to a character called Lilith. Now the stories surrounding Lilith are so contradictory and confusing that it's virtually impossible to get to the root of it all, but in nearly all cultures she is thought of as a powerful female demon. The most commonly accepted myth about her from the Jewish Kabbalah is that she was the original wife of Adam in the Garden of Eden, predating Eve. The story goes that when they came to have sex, Lilith refused to lie underneath Adam in what she perceived to be a submissive position, and instead demanded to be on top. She wanted to be dominant over Adam. According to the Kabbalah, this fight led to Lilith flying away from the garden to a cave on the shores of the Red Sea. Within the cave she accepted the demons of the world as her lovers and spawned thousands of demon children in a short period of time. She then became known as the mother of demons and the wife of a character called Asmodeus, who was considered to be the king of demons. In this form she is known as the younger Lilith. According to the Kabbalah, Adam then tried to make peace with her by asking God to send 3 angels to reason with her and bring her back. If she refused to return to the garden, the angels informed her that they would kill 100 of her demon children every day. Lilith still refused, and in her jealousy of Eve, Adam's new wife, she swore to exact a similar kind of punishment on her children. She would attack and kill the children of Adam and Eve. She also vowed to attack men in their sleep, not to kill them but to rape them for semen, so she could give birth to more demon children. So therefore she became known as a succubus, a female demon who attacks people sexually at night. The whole idea of demons interacting with humans sexually in ancient times exists in the Bible also, when it talks about the Nephilim around the time of Noah. Some traditions depict Lilith as being part serpent, and some even depict her as being embodied in the serpent in the Garden of Eden, as though she was somehow present in that moment. In these traditions she is represented as the wife of Satan or Samael, and the suggestion there is that the temptation of Adam and Eve was a joint effort between the two. Lilith provided the body and Satan the voice. As the wife of Samael rather than Asmodeus, she is known as the elder Lilith. This may seem like a minor alleyway to be spending so much time on, but the word Lilith is actually mentioned once in the Bible, in Isaiah 34:14. Modern versions translate the name as things like night creatures or night monster, night animals, and in the Old King James Version it's translated as screech owl, hence the association with owls. Other versions say night owl or night bird, so esoterically owls represent this female demon. Lilith is also particularly important because Satanists revere her as the rising queen of our age, the most prominent demon of our times. Anton LaVey proclaimed in 1966 that that would be the year of the beginning of the Age of Satan, but that it could be more accurately described as the Age of Lilith. He thought her influence would grow immensely from that point and start to define our times. And her traits do indeed correspond closely to the social trends of the past 2 centuries, and in particular the past few decades. Up until the 1800s, Lilith was always seen as a dark, evil demon, but after that century, sympathetic artistic portrayals began to emerge. She is now not thought of as an evil demon, but rather a noble goddess, and her traits are becoming revered and loved. For example, Lilith is something of a role model and figurehead for the feminist movement because of her independence and desire not to be submissive to men. She is also therefore the demon behind the natural conclusion of feminism, which is lesbianism. She may also be the force behind cross-dressing and transsexuality. Things associated with her today also include what the world would call sexual freedom, i.e. fornication. This definitely erupted in our culture in 1966 as contraception and technology changed the relationship between people and Lilith. Just the following year, in 1967, the so-called Summer of Love happened, where everyone basically went sex crazy. People feel they can now embrace Lilith and her lusts with no repercussions. However, she is also the demon behind murderous abortions and sexual diseases, which are the natural results of licentious living. These things are skyrocketing beyond control in our modern world. Lilith represents things which are beautiful and tempting on the outside, but which lead to destruction, the kind of woman that Proverbs warns against in the Bible. Finally, Lilith is also associated with the modern, glamorized image of vampires which has become incredibly popular of late. Several translations of the Bible use the term night monsters or night creatures for the word Lilith, and the 1922 Moffat translation of the Bible explicitly translate the words as vampires. Vampires, of course, are night creatures who attack people in their sleep, feeding off the lifeblood of those individuals. At the time of this video in 2011, this is one of the most noticeable manifestations of Lilith, as you can't help but notice the increasing glamorization of vampires with movies such as Twilight by Stephenie Meyer. Connected with vampires is also the idea of immortality without reference to God, which is also appealing to occultists. Many of Lilith's traits correspond exactly with Asherah, but traditionally she has always been considered to be a separate being. Therefore, how closely they are connected is hard to discern. I personally would suggest that their traits are so similar that they are in fact the same force. Further evidence to support this theory can be found when we consider that Lilith was identified by occultist Aleister Crowley and others under the name Babylon. Perhaps Lilith was the demon that controlled Semiramis and which then became known as Jezebel or Asherah. As Satan attempts to re-establish Babylon in the modern world, it is for these reasons that Lilith or Asherah is considered by his followers to be the most important rising goddess of our time. If you're not convinced that the image of the capital really represents an owl, however, and to be fair, some aren't, it's also worth mentioning a place called Bohemian Grove. The Bohemian Club was established in 1872 in San Francisco as an exclusive club for political and intellectual figures who wanted to spend some time each year relaxing and interacting in a non-business environment. In other words, a playground for the elite. They began camping at the present site of what's known today as Bohemian Grove, 2,437 acres of private redwood forest sealed off by security. Every midsummer around 1,500 of the most powerful politicians and businessmen from within and from without the United States attend. Early sources suggest it was established specifically for people who would become part of what we now call the media, basically the people with the power to influence public opinion, artists, writers, movie makers, etc. The all-male membership contains a particularly high number of musicians. Their involvement helps explain the name Bohemian Grove. Every Republican president since 1923 and some Democrats have been members there. Cabinet officials, directors and CEOs of large corporations, including major financial institutions, also attend. Major military contractors, oil companies, banks, including the Federal Reserve, utilities, including nuclear power, and national media have high-ranking officials as club members. The Grove appears to act as an informal doorway to the world of the elite. It's like the equivalent of the outermost circle of a satanic cult, or the lowest levels of Freemasonry. People who attend are invited to bring guests with them each year. These guests are then sifted to find the ones who are most potentially useful for their aims. Doors are then opened to the inner circles for these people, and they are fast-tracked in their professions, whether it be politics, business, or the media. Along with the fast-tracking comes the promise of huge wealth. The newcomers are puffed up with pride, and appeals are made to their egotism and selfishness. They are told they are special and have unique gifts and talents. The exclusivity of the event is highlighted, and they are made to feel a sense of belonging. This is all designed to transfer their loyalties away from mankind in general, the masses, towards the establishment or the elite. On the first Saturday of the camp, the attendees perform a druid pagan ritual called the Cremation of Care. It begins with a procession of men in red robes and pointed hoods, some playing a funeral dirge and others carrying flaming torches. Transcripts from these rituals have been obtained and include specific references to Babylon and goodly Tyre. Remembering the Prince of Tyre, King of Tyre connection, we know that esoterically this refers to Satan. The cremation of care ceremony has the usual light meaning and dark meaning. The light meaning is that they are casting off their cares and worries so that they can enjoy their holiday. The real dark meaning is that the word care is another word for conscience. Therefore the ritual represents a cremation or killing of the conscience, which will allow them to plot and partake in evil deeds. Remember how the Jesuits had to play mind tricks on themselves to try and overcome or bypass their conscience. It appears these Masons have a similar problem, and this ritual is a concerted effort to get rid of it. It all takes place in front of this giant owl.
Time malevolence which would pursue us here has lost its power under these friendly trees. So shall we burn thee once again this night, and in the flames that eat thine effigy, we shall read the sign, Midsummer sets us free.
You shall burn me once again! Not with these flames, which hither ye have brought from regions where I reign. Ye fools and priests, I spit upon your fire.
Wow. Great symbol of all mortal wisdom, Owl of Bohemia, we beseech thee, grant us thy counsel. O great Owl of Bohemia, we thank thee for thy adjuration. Begone, dull care. Fire shall have its will of thee. Begone, dull care. And all the winds make merry with thy dust. Hail, fellowship's eternal flame. Once again, midsummer sets us free.
Pretty scary stuff, right? But this is what the elite call a good time on their holidays. Now, most accounts suggest that this owl is the form of Baal called Molech. He is mentioned in the Bible as one who demands child sacrifice and fire. However, the owl imagery aligns it more with Lilith, Athena, or Asherah, the goddess in other words. I could be wrong, but it seems more likely that this is an idol for her. Ultimately, it doesn't really matter, as both are just facets of Satan. But given what we know about Lilith, it's also interesting that cross-dressing is apparently prevalent at the Grove, as it is with many occult societies that honour her. The Nebraska-based Knights of Aksar Ben are reported to participate in a festivity called High Jinks in Hades involving cross-dressing. A similarly named activity goes on at Bohemian Grove, where it is reported that the men and boys parade in women's clothing or dress up as Egyptian goddesses. Gender ambiguity in the ancient Mediterranean world was prevalent wherever the goddess Ishtar or Asherah was worshipped. Indeed, they had cult festivals specifically characterized by cross-dressing. There was one thing I didn't mention about the $1 bill before. It's an owl that sits in the top right-hand corner, seen in this photo. Interestingly, some see a spider in this image instead of an owl. Personally, I believe it's an owl, but it's interesting that this sign exists at the entrance to Bohemian Grove. It reads, "Weaving spiders come not here," and so we have a sign here that combines both the owl and the spider. Manly P. Hall confirms and elaborates on what the evidence seems to support. Not only were many of the founders of the United States government Masons, but they received aid from a secret and august body existing in Europe, which helped them to establish this country for a peculiar and particular purpose, known only to the initiated few. Before we finish off this third section covering the Enlightenment era and move on to the present day, we need to explore more about this European secret body who were aiding the establishment of a Masonic America. Back in the Old Testament, we spent a good while looking at the dream that Daniel interpreted for Nebuchadnezzar, where he envisioned a figure whose head was made of gold, whose arms and chest were of silver, whose belly and thighs were bronze, and whose legs were iron mixed with clay at the feet. These represented the four great earthly kingdoms that were to come: Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome. We'll do a quick recap here. In your vision, your majesty, you saw standing before you a huge shining statue of a man. It was a frightening sight. The head of the statue was made of fine gold, its chest and arms were silver, its belly and thighs were bronze, its legs were iron, and its feet were a combination of iron and baked clay. As you watched, a rock was cut from a mountain, but not by human hands. It struck the feet of the iron and clay, smashing them to bits. The whole statue was crushed into small pieces of iron, clay, bronze, silver, and gold. Then the wind blew them away without a trace, like chaff on a threshing floor. But the rock that knocked the statue down became a great mountain that covered the whole earth. Daniel goes on to interpret this vision. After your kingdom comes to an end, another kingdom inferior to yours will rise to take your place. After that kingdom has fallen, yet a third kingdom, represented by bronze, will rise to rule the world. Following that kingdom, there will be a fourth one as strong as iron. That kingdom will smash and crush all previous empires, just as iron smashes and crushes everything it strikes. The feet and toes you saw were a combination of iron and baked clay, showing that this kingdom will be divided. Like iron mixed with clay, it will have some of the strength of iron, but while some parts of it will be as strong as iron, other parts will be as weak as clay. This mixture of iron and clay also shows that these kingdoms will try to strengthen themselves by forming alliances with each other through intermarriage, but they will not hold together, just as iron and clay do not mix. During the reigns of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that will never be destroyed or conquered. It will crush all these kingdoms into nothingness, and it will stand forever. That is the meaning of the rock cut from the mountain, though not by human hands, that crushed to pieces the statue of iron, bronze, clay, silver, and gold. The great God was showing the king what will happen in the future. The dream is true, and its meaning is certain. The important thing to note here is that the fourth and final empire in Daniel 2 refers to both a historic Rome and an end-time world empire or government. How do we know this? Well, in Daniel 2:34 we read that God will take a rock and strike the statue at the feet. When he does this, it will completely destroy the whole statue. This refers to the second coming of Christ, where Jesus, the stone from the mountain of God, crushes not only the final empire but also all trace of the previous world empires. This whole mystery system stemming from Babylon will be completely destroyed and blown away like chaff in the wind. When Christ destroys all trace of these old kingdoms, he will then establish his own eternal kingdom that will cover the whole earth. Now, if the statue is struck on the feet, meaning the Roman Empire, this means that the Roman Empire will have to exist in some form at the end of the age. This is often referred to as the revived Roman Empire or the revived Holy Roman Empire. This will be the dominant kingdom at the end of time and the system through which the Antichrist will come. Later, in Daniel 7, these same four successive kingdoms of Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, and Rome were shown to Daniel in another vision, this time in the shape of animals. There it says, "The first beast was like a lion with eagle's wings." That means Babylon. Then I saw a second beast, and it looked like a bear. That means Medo-Persia. Then the third of these strange beasts appeared, and it looked like a leopard. It had 4 birds' wings on its back, and it had 4 heads. That means Greece. Then in my vision that night I saw a fourth beast, terrifying, dreadful, and very strong. It devoured and crushed its victims with huge iron teeth and trampled their remains beneath its feet. It was different from any of the other beasts, and it had 10 horns. And that means Rome. Fast forward to the end times, and in Revelation 13 we read about a beast rising out of the sea. In biblical prophecy, the sea represents the peoples of the earth. So out of the peoples of the earth comes a beast, and it is described like this. Then I saw a beast rising up out of the sea. It had 7 heads and 10 horns, with 10 crowns on its horns, and written on each head were names that blasphemed God. This beast looked like a leopard, but it had the feet of a bear and the mouth of a lion. And the dragon gave the beast his own power and throne and great authority. Notice that this beast is a mixture of the 4 animals from Daniel 7. This end times beast therefore represents an amalgamation of the 4 world empires: Babylon the lion, Medo-Persia the bear, Greece the leopard, and then they become one in Rome. The dominant end times kingdom will be an embodiment of all those separate kingdoms in one. Revelation 13 goes on to say that, I saw that one of the heads of the beast seemed wounded beyond recovery, but the fatal wound was healed. The whole world marveled at this miracle and gave allegiance to the beast. They worshipped the dragon for giving the beast such power, and they also worshipped the beast. Who is as great as the beast, they exclaimed. Who is able to fight against him? So the end time kingdom is going to be unbelievably powerful, and people will think it is far too strong for anyone to fight against or overcome. And that may be true, humanly speaking. However, they haven't reckoned with Jesus, who will return this time, not as a lamb to the slaughter, but as the rampaging lion of the tribe of Judah, a warrior with robes dipped in blood. In Revelation 19:11-15 we read, Then I saw heaven opened, and a white horse was standing there. Its rider was named Faithful and True, for he judges fairly and wages a righteous war. His eyes were like flames of fire, and on his head were many crowns. A name was written on him that no one understood except himself. He wore a robe dipped in blood, and his title was the Word of God. The armies of heaven, dressed in the finest of pure white linen, followed him on white horses. From his mouth came a sharp sword to strike down the nations. The present-day European Union is that revived Roman Empire prophesied about in Daniel. The nations are trying to mix together like iron and clay, but it will not hold together and it won't prevail. We'll look more at the EU in the next few parts. We know that occultists like to do their talking through symbols, so we only have to look at those surrounding the new Europe to see evidence of what it truly represents. At the moment there are 2 European Parliament buildings, one in Brussels, Belgium, and a more recent construction in Strasbourg, France. This is a picture of the one in Strasbourg, which has deliberately been built to symbolize the unfinished Tower of Babel. Now why is it circular and not a ziggurat or pyramid shape? Well, they based the design on this painting by a 16th century artist, Peter Bruegel. So although the painting is inaccurate and consequently the design of the building is inaccurate, the intent behind it is clear to see. This is the poster that announced the completion of the Strasbourg Tower in 1999. As you can see, they didn't even try to hide the fact that it was based on the Tower of Babel, as they used a representation of the original painting in the poster rather than a photo of the actual building. This poster was actually banned after it caused so much controversy. The slogan at the bottom right reads, "Many tongues, one voice." Remember that God scattered people with different languages to stop them constructing their satanic system and their satanic tower. Well, here they explicitly reveal the intention to reverse what God did at the original Tower of Babel and to reconvene in unified defiance of God. It has taken several millennia for Satan to achieve this reversal, but in modern-day Europe, and indeed in the whole world, there is now a dominant international language of English that the vast majority understand. This allows cooperation between nations that had been impossible since Genesis 11. You may also notice that there are 12 stars around the top of the tower in the poster. The EU flag is a circle of 12 stars, but notice that these particular stars are inverted. We know that inverted pentagrams represent Satan as the horned god Baphomet. So we have openly satanic symbols not only alongside, but encircling and hovering over the new Parliament building. This is symbolic of Satan's position of authority in the European system. Here is the actual EU flag. The European flag was itself designed by a devout Catholic, Arsène Heitz, who was inspired by the halo of 12 stars that often encircles Mary's head in Catholic pictures. Pope John Paul dedicated the continent of Europe to Mary, and his successor Pope Benedict XVI made the unification of Europe under Mary's Catholicism the primary goal of his papacy. Because the Catholic Mary is none other than the ancient demonic deity Asherah, they were dedicating the European Union to her spiritual rule. One thing I've also noticed recently about the EU flag is that they've started stylizing it into an all-seeing eye symbol at various events. The circle of stars becomes the center of the eye, and the lines above and below act as the lids. The national anthem for the European Union is Ode to Joy. The lyrics were written by Friedrich Schiller, and the poetic translation of the German goes as follows. Joyful spark of hope and glory, unity with the divine, drunken under fire goddess, we approach thy holy shrine. Thy magic shall unite forever those nations which were not. Every mortal becomes one, and your rule shall not be forgot. So the national anthem of Europe is therefore an anthem to Asherah that talks about bringing everyone into unity with the divine so that we may become as gods ourselves. It talks about entering the shrine of the pagan goddess with drunkenness and being united by the power of magic and fire. This is deeply wicked stuff. Within the main chamber of the Strasbourg unfinished tower building there are 679 seats. They have all been filled except one which currently lies empty, the 666th one. And now to the crux of the matter. One of the first things I did in this series was to draw a line from Genesis 11 that talked about a literal Babylon to Revelation 17 that talked about Mystery Babylon as the mother of all prostitutes, the fountainhead of evil. My goal throughout this whole series in a way has been to show the link between those 2 points. So we can now go to Revelation 17 and it should start to make a lot of sense. Come with me, he said, and I will show you the judgment that is going to come on the great prostitute who rules over many waters. The kings of the world have committed adultery with her, and the people who belong to this world have been made drunk by the wine of her immorality. So the angel took me in the spirit into the wilderness. There I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that had 7 heads and 10 horns, and blasphemies against God were written all over it. The woman wore purple and scarlet clothing and beautiful jewellery made of gold and precious gems and pearls. In her hand she held a gold goblet full of obscenities and the impurities of her immorality. A mysterious name was written on her forehead, Babylon the Great, mother of all prostitutes and obscenities in the world. I could see that she was drunk with the blood of God's holy people who were witnesses for Jesus. I stared at her in complete amazement. The woman, as we know, is the goddess who is the embodiment of this false religious system that started back in Babylon. The same false mystery religion we've been following throughout all history in this series. Continuously throughout that time, the same goddess has kept popping up in the background under the name of Semiramis, or Asherah, or Jezebel, or Mary, or the goddess of reason. This evil system is the source of all obscenities in the world. We've seen that. How what started in Babylon has flowed down through history, creating all false religions and polluting people with evil ideas, causing oppression, death and misery by various means. Revelation tells us she is drunk with the blood of God's holy people. We've seen that too. We saw what she did to true Christians through Catholicism and through the Jesuits and through the French Revolution, to name just a few examples. She killed anyone who got in her way. Now what does Revelation 17 say she rides in on? What is she paired with or connected to? The beast she is riding matches the description of the beast from Revelation 13 and Daniel 7, the end-time empire of iron and clay. This New World Order, amalgamation of all the previous world empires centered in Europe. It has the same description. 7 heads and 10 horns and blasphemies written all over it. So the woman or prostitute represents the false mystery religion. The beast that she rides in on represents the false political or temporal system. And this is a picture of what Semiramis did with Nimrod back in Babylon. Remember that Semiramis was primarily the religious figurehead and Nimrod was primarily the political figurehead. And the spiritual is actually more important because spiritual authority sits behind temporal authority to give it strength. So get the image in your mind of a woman riding on a beast. And now look at this monument which sits outside the Strasbourg building. And now look at this one outside the Brussels building. A woman riding a beast, specifically a bull, is actually one of the primary motifs for Europe and has appeared on stamps, phone cards and currency. We know that Nimrod or Baal was represented as a bull in ancient times, so here we have Baal and Asherah all over the stamps and currency and outside both parliament buildings. The prostitute and the beast, the false religious system riding in on the back of the false political system, the male and the female in one. The reason this logo was picked because in the Greek form of the Mysteries, Asherah became known as Europa. So actually, the entire continent is named after Asherah. And in one story, Zeus saw this beautiful woman, ran into the ocean with her and raped her. After her death, she was then given the title, the Queen of Heaven, which we also know is a title Asherah uses. The European Union has 3 legislative branches: the European Commission, the European Council, and the European Parliament. Most of the legislative power lies with the Commission and the Council. Both of these branches are completely undemocratic. Those on the Commission are unelected, and it is unaccountable to any electorate. It cannot be changed or removed by the people. When the commissioners are given their role, they take an oath to abandon any national allegiance. So effectively it is run by an elite who can do what they like, and they are the ones who come up with the policies in the EU. The next branch down, the European Council, is made up of the Prime Ministers and Presidents of Member States. While they have been elected by the people of their nation, they make decisions without consulting national parliaments and act effectively like elected dictators. People in Britain will remember Gordon Brown sneaking off to Lisbon to sign away our sovereignty on what was effectively a constitution without referring to the people, because he knew that we would reject it if asked. He gave us no say in the matter and did it anyway. All these national leaders don't get to create policies, they only vote on policies handed down to them by the Commission, that is, the unelected elite at the top. The third branch, the European Parliament, is the only branch with any democratic principles at all, but it has very little power by comparison with the other 2. Every year, countries hand over more and more of their national sovereignty to the centralised dictatorship. Here in Britain, we've had several examples recently of Europe imposing law changes on our country by people none of us voted for and who none of us know or want. Our politicians carry on regardless. As you can see, the stage is being set for the emergence of a global political system, a global economic system, and a global religious system based on the mystery Babylon religion. But if the European Union will be the most powerful empire at the end of time, there is still a whole world out there to be brought into line. Another occult organisation has been tasked with that project, the United Nations. Very simply, the whole purpose of the United Nations is to reverse the scattering of Babylon and to bring all the nations of the world back together again. When we think about the aims of the United Nations, we generally think about them as peacekeepers trying to create political peace and unity, but the scope of their intentions extends far beyond this. They want to unite the world spiritually too. That's because you can't unite the world politically until it's been united spiritually. We've seen that theme throughout history, but I'll add another layer to that later. Now, the United Nations, as we know, is a successor to the League of Nations that was initiated after World War I in 1919 to promote international cooperation to achieve peace and security. It was during the Second World War on 1st of January 1942 that the name United Nations was first coined by illuminist Franklin D. Roosevelt. 26 nations came together to pledge their commitment to continue fighting against the Axis powers of the day. 3 years later, in 1945, as the war was ending, representatives of 50 countries met in San Francisco at the United Nations Conference on International Organization to draw up the United Nations Charter. It was signed on 26th of June 1945 by all member countries and then later by Poland, who became the 51st member state. The UN officially came into existence on 24th of October 1945, and every year on this date it is celebrated as United Nations Day. So what about this charter then? Well, it copied heavily from the original charter drawn up for the League of Nations. This original charter was heavily influenced by Arthur Balfour, who we have met already as the one who handed Israel over to the Rothschilds. Balfour, apart from being British Prime Minister at this time, was a member of a number of occult groups, including the Society for Psychic Research, or SPR. Activities for this group included the holding of seances and attempts to communicate with the dead. He was also responsible for initiating a group called the Synthetic Society, whose primary aim was to establish a synthesized one-world religion. He, along with Frederick Myers, a fellow member of the SPR, created the preamble of all religions. Balfour had such unusual character traits and behaviours that it coined its own term, the Balfour Manner. Amongst those traits was a lust for control and power, an aloof pride, and constant restlessness and dissatisfaction. These are all character traits associated with Satan, and they hint at his influence and presence with Balfour. In particular, the constant restlessness is unusual and puts us in mind of one of Satan's most famous names, Beelzebub or Baalzebub, the Lord of Restless and Unsettled Motion. Harold Begbie wrote about him in his 1920 book, Mirrors of Downing Street, saying, "He loves office more than anything this world can offer. Neither in philosophy nor music, literature nor science has he ever been able to find rest for his soul. It is profoundly instructive that a man with a real talent for the noblest of those pursuits which make solitude desirable in retirement and opportunity should be so restless and dissatisfied, even in old age." He loved power more than anything and couldn't find rest. His dabbling in the occult seems to have opened up the door for demonic influence in his life, and it is from this character, Balfour, that we get the first signs of the establishment of a one-world religion within a political organization, the League of Nations. The United Nations that followed used various elements of the League of Nations as a template, and the nature of those pioneers that followed wasn't much of an improvement on Balfour. The two men who were largely responsible for writing the UN Charter were Alger Hiss and Joseph E. Johnson. Alger Hiss was accused of being a Soviet spy, charged with espionage against the United States, and of being a member of the United States Communist Party. At his trial he was found guilty of several counts of perjury and was imprisoned for the same. This was the man who became the first acting Secretary General of the United Nations. Joseph E. Johnson later became secretary of the Bilderberg Group, a secret Masonic society containing persons of influence in the fields of politics, banking, business, the military, and media. I've pretty much sidestepped organizations like those, but if you do any research at all into this subject, you'll quickly come across that name. Along with Hiss, Johnson patterned the UN Charter after the Constitution of Russia and the Communist Manifesto. The Communist Manifesto was of course written by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels, those whose ideas can be traced back to Plato and the Kabbalah through the Enlightenment and French Revolution. As a result of these connections, the Constitution of the USSR is said to be almost identical to the Constitution of the UN. The first official Secretary General, in other words the first leader of the United Nations, was a man called Trygve Lie. He was a high-ranking official of Norway's Social Democratic Labour Party, which was an offshoot of the Third Communist International. Dag Hammarskjöld was the second Secretary General, and he was a Swedish socialist who openly pushed communist policies. The third Secretary General, U Thant, was a Marxist. You get the idea. U Thant openly stated, "World Federalists hold before us a vision of a unified mankind living in peace under a just world order. The heart of their program, a world under law, is realistic and attainable." This was backed up by most leaders of the day. Winston Churchill said, "The creation of an authoritative world order is the ultimate aim to which we must strive." Charles de Gaulle, the French president, said, "Nations must unite in a world government or perish." Perhaps the most prominent UN figurehead with regards to spiritual unification of the world is this man, Robert Mueller. He died in 2010, but was Under-Secretary General of the UN for 40 years, and he is revered within the UN as the philosopher or prophet of hope of the United Nations. His spiritual viewpoints were quite clear. He said, "We must move as quickly as possible to a one-world government, a one-world religion, under a one-world leader." He believed that peace for this one world order rested primarily on religion, saying, "Peace will be impossible without the taming of fundamentalism through a united religions that professes faithfulness only to the global spirituality and to the health of this planet." He also said, "My great personal dream is to get a tremendous alliance between all the major religions and the UN." Because he held one of the top jobs in the UN for 40 years, he obviously had huge influence on the goals of the organization, but the problem goes much further than that, because as well as being the driving force behind the spirituality of the UN, he also created something called the World Core Curriculum, which, as the name suggests, is intended to be an education program or framework for the entire world. He is therefore also known throughout the world as the father of global education. Not only this, but he actually established specialist Robert Muller schools, where his educational ideas could be taught in their purest form. There are over 30 in existence, and more are being established each year. The World Core Curriculum earned him the UNESCO Peace Education Prize in 1989. Now, since UNESCO is just an NGO of the UN, that seems a little meaningless to give yourself an award, but anyway, following the plaudits he received from within the UN, he also drew up a framework for world media coverage, as well as a framework for planetary and cosmic consciousness, and a framework for arts and culture. Basically, these are plans for how they might dominate the information flows to influence the mindsets of the world. My focus is the World Core Curriculum because the idea was that the UN issues this document to the nations, who then use it as the framework for their own regional school curriculums. By this method, all the schools around the world would start teaching their kids the same ideas about life. The coming generations would then have the same worldview and the same attitudes for the New World Order. Robert Muller said of it that we must steer our children toward global citizenship, earth-centered beliefs, socialist values, and the collective mindset which is becoming a requirement for the 21st century workforce. He went on to say, "A World Core Curriculum might seem utopian today. By the end of the year 2000, it will be a down-to-earth daily reality in all the schools of the world." Now, he was a little ambitious with the timescale, but the determination to see it happen hasn't gone away. Here in Scotland, a new curriculum has just been introduced called the Curriculum for Excellence, and although it has been heavily criticised by parents and by teachers alike, it openly bases itself on UN frameworks, and one of its key components is preparing children for global citizenship, and it uses phrases like the child's well-being and well-becoming. Most people wouldn't pick up on that, but we know from the evolution part that the word becoming is an occult term for the evolution towards godhood. So if this World Core Curriculum is to be the source for national curriculums around the world that will be taught to coming generations of children, we need to find out what's in it. Robert Muller wrote in the World Core Curriculum notes that the underlying philosophy upon which the Robert Muller School is based will be found in the teachings set forth in the books of Alice A. Bailey. The school is now certified as a United Nations associated school providing education for international cooperation and peace. So this whole curriculum that is to be implemented around the world, and which is to be fed to every child on the planet to prepare them for a one-world government, rests upon the philosophies of this one woman called Alice A. Bailey. We better find out more about her. We already know that modern-day Israel, at least in an earthly sense, had a lot to do with the efforts of the Rothschilds. Some more symbolism that gives that away can be found in the Israeli Supreme Court. The Israeli Supreme Court was funded by the Rothschilds on the condition that they would choose the plot of land, would use their own architect, and that the price of its construction would never be made public. Built in 1992 in Jerusalem, it sits next to the Knesset, which is the main political building in Israel. Also funded by the Rothschilds, the Knesset is the legislative branch of the Israeli government, where laws are enacted and heads of state are elected. Here is the picture of the Supreme Court. This painting is at the entrance to the building and depicts the Rothschilds planning its design along with Shimon Peres and Isaac Rabin. A journey through the Supreme Court esoterically represents a path towards illumination. The ultimate goal of the journey is to reach this pyramid, which represents the most holy place in the building. Each side of the pyramid has a circular hole at the top representing the all-seeing eye. Let's do a picture walkthrough along this so-called path of illumination from the beginning, and do some symbol spotting along the way. Firstly, the person who enters the Supreme Court finds himself in a dark area in front of a stairway leading to a source of light at the other end. By climbing these stairs, the visitor gradually moves away from the darkness towards illumination. There are exactly 3 sets of 10 steps equaling 30 overall. These represent the first 30 degrees of Freemasonry. Since there are 33 degrees to Freemasonry overall, we will discover where the remaining 3 are later. You'll notice that the right side of the wall is made from rough old rocks, reminiscent of ancient Jerusalem walls, while the left is smooth and modern. This represents the timeless nature of the occult teachings that have been transmitted from ancient Babylon to today, and is a repeated theme throughout the Supreme Court. Having climbed the steps, the visitor finds that he is on a high point with a great view over the rooftops of Jerusalem. We know that Satan wants to try and claim the high points in a region because he wants to be the most high, so no further explanation is required here. Embedded on the floor is a line which guides the traveller to the entrance of the library, which is placed right underneath the Great Pyramid. This is the path you walk to the holiest place, and of course the library itself represents knowledge. This picture is taken from the 2nd floor of that library. The library is actually divided into 3 levels, symbolically representing the final 3 degrees of Freemasonry. The first level is reserved for lawyers only, the second is reserved for judges only, and the books on the 3rd level can only be read by retired judges. This represents the movement through the degrees, acquiring higher and higher knowledge. The library functions like all occult hierarchies, where some information is the exclusive privilege of a select few. These are the 3 levels of the library. Right above the 3rd level, representing the final degree of Freemasonry, there is this view of the pyramid. This is where the Freemasonry ends and the elite Illuminati begins. Directly beneath the apex of the pyramid is this geometric floor pattern, with a crystal embedded in the floor at the center. There are 6 squares representing the number of man, and each square of course has 4 sides, which is the number that represents the world. The crystal in the center lies directly under the apex of the pyramid. This is similar to the sun symbol embedded at the center of the Capitol crypt in Washington, D.C. The entrances to the courtrooms themselves look like this. They are said to resemble ancient Jewish tombs. Apparently in some Jewish tombs there were holes where the soul was supposed to leave. They have retained these holes in the courtrooms, perhaps to allow spirits to come and go in a similar manner. Again, notice the contrast between the old and the new here. The prison cells, the courtroom, and the judges' quarters are placed one on top of the other, symbolizing the tiered society as proposed by Plato and the Enlightenment thinkers. The ruling elite at the top represented by the judges' quarters, the auxiliaries like the police and civil servants in the middle to enforce the decrees of those at the top, represented by the courtroom, and the massive ignorant prisoners below. This is one of the courtrooms. The judge is illuminated by a natural source of light at the far end, symbolically representing the light of the divine, guiding their wisdom. They retire to their quarters at the top tier to make a decision and then descend back to the courtroom below to bring their illuminating wisdom to the world. Now let's start making our way outside. No occult structure would be complete without the obligatory sexual symbols, and the steps outside the courtrooms provide this feature. Again, this needs little explanation. Once outside the building, we are then invited to visit the Dorothy Rothschild Grove. We find this plaque on the wall with the arrow. Alongside it, we also find this plaque, which also contains an all-seeing eye. Sorry about the quality of these, I couldn't find anything more clear-cut. When we follow the arrow, though, to the Dorothy Rothschild Grove, we find this monument, which is obviously an obelisk, an Ashtoreth pole. If we then go to the centre of the parking facilities from here, we find this shape on the ground. Now, some people have suggested that this represents a cross so that people can trample on it as they descend down the steps. I don't personally buy into this theory. To me, it just looks like a sun symbol. All these things, again, are just evidence of the Rothschilds' occult influence. The beginnings of Mormonism will sound quite familiar to anyone who has been following this series. It began when its founder, Joseph Smith, claimed to have been visited by an angel of light called Moroni, who preached to him a different gospel to that found in the Bible. Joseph Smith himself belonged to a family that was heavily involved with Freemasonry. In the Mormon Church and Freemasonry, Terry Chateau writes, "The Joseph Smith family was a Masonic family which lived by and practiced the estimable and admirable tenets of Freemasonry. The father, Joseph Smith Sr., was a documented member in upstate New York. He was raised to the degree of Master Mason on May the 7th, 1818, in Ontario Lodge No. 23 of Canandaigua, New York. An older son, Hiram Smith, was a member of Mount Moriah, Lodge No. 112, Palmyra, New York. Joseph Smith was also a Freemason himself, who joined the lodge in 1842. In his book History of the Church he says, he was with the Masonic Lodge and rose to the sublime degree. As a result of these connections, Joseph Smith borrowed heavily, you could actually say plagiarized from Freemasonry in the formation of his own religion, and the two therefore share extensive commonalities in terms of symbols, signs, handshakes, vocabulary, and clothing such as aprons and robes. Mormon temple garments also tellingly bear the square and compass symbol from Freemasonry, although Joseph Smith gave all these things a slightly different meaning. I'm not going to go into too much depth on Mormonism, but we only need to have a quick look around the home and centerpiece of the religion, Temple Square in Utah, which was designed to be an equivalent to the temple in Jerusalem, to see the same old Babylonian symbols. The inverted pentagram representing Satan, for example, is to be found all around Temple Square in many different forms, such as here above the windows. We also see images of the sun, and the combination of sun and moon that represents the union of the male and female principles. Above the door we also find the all-seeing eye peeking out from behind a veil and surrounded by a sunburst. The veil could well represent the initiation of going through the veil towards the light, or the fact that the true nature of the cult is veiled to the uninitiated. One of the ideas Joseph Smith took from Freemasonry for his cult was secret handshakes, and this is also alluded to on the temple. Masonic buildings have similar engravings such as this. Within Temple Square there is a museum documenting the history of the Mormon Church. It too contains the symbols that betray its mystery root. These pentagrams are to be found at the entrance to the museum. Manly P. Hall wrote, "In symbolism, an inverted figure always signifies a perverted power. The average person does not even suspect the occult properties of emblematic pentacles." You'll also find this sun god symbol at the same entrance, just right of the pentagrams. And now finally, here are some more of those inverted pentagrams in the kids' corner. Mormons are similar to Catholics in that many Christians are not sure what to make of them. They seem to be clean living, well-meaning, and use many of the same words as us, so there can be an attitude that they're basically on the same team with just one or two unorthodox ideas. Mormons actually believe that they can become gods through being a good Mormon, who will one day be given godhood over their own universes, and that God himself was once a man on another planet. These are, of course, lies straight from the serpent's mouth. They believe the Book of Mormon has higher authority than the Bible. They believe that there are many gods, that there is a mother god, that God has a goddess wife, that there is no salvation outside of the Mormon Church or without acknowledging Joseph Smith as a prophet, and they also state that Jesus' sacrifice on the cross was not enough by itself, and that we need to do good works as well, which is always a mark of a false religion. Hopefully this information, along with a quick look at the symbols, will tell you just who the spiritual power behind the cult of Mormonism really is, and we'll discover it has no compatibility with Christianity at all. The Jehovah's Witnesses are a far more subtle cult in many ways than Mormonism, but their ideas will be recognizable to you if you've come this far in the series. The Jehovah's Witnesses were founded by a man called Charles Taze Russell in the late 19th century, and the first thing to say about him is that he believed that lying was a good thing if the end justified the means. This has been a recurring theme throughout the series that we've seen in relation to Plato, Islam, and the Illuminated Masons in particular. Their own publication, the Watchtower magazine, stated on May 15, 1960 that the scriptures justify the war strategy of hiding true facts from the enemy. The following month, on June 1st, 1960, it repeated the idea, saying, as a soldier of Christ, he is in theocratic warfare, and he must exercise caution when dealing with God's foes. Thus the scriptures show that for the purposes of protecting the interests of God's cause, it is proper to hide the truth from God's enemies. Because Jehovah's Witnesses don't believe anyone outside of their cult has true salvation, that means that Christians are included along with the enemies of God in their eyes. That means they believe it is acceptable to lie to us if the end justifies the means. This instantly removes any weight we may have otherwise given to their words, and we have to instead look at their actions, ideas, and symbols for the truth. Charles Taze Russell was a member of a Congregational church as a youth, but in his teens he lost faith and, hungrily, he began investigating the heathen religions in search of the truth on God's purpose and man's destiny. He picked up many occult ideas and intermingled them with his own faith, and also gained a number of Masonic friends. Although there is much debate about how involved he was with Freemasonry and whether he was a Mason himself, what is clear is that he exalted Masonic beliefs and used occult images in his own publications. In a discourse he gave in 1913 called The Temple of God, he said, I am very glad to have this particular opportunity of saying a word about some of the things in which we agree with our Masonic friends, because we are speaking in a building dedicated to Masonry, and we are also Masons. I am a Freemason. I am a free and accepted Mason, if I may carry the matter to its full length, because that is what our Masonic brethren like to tell us, that they are free and accepted Masons. That is their style of putting it. I trust we all are, but not just after the style of our Masonic brethren. We have no quarrel with them. I'm not going to say a word against Freemasons. In fact, some of my very dear friends are Masons, and I can appreciate that there are certain very precious truths that are held in part by our Masonic friends. I have talked to them at times, and they have said, how do you know about all of these things? We thought nobody knew anything about these things except those who had access to the very highest logic. Russell went on to use a Masonic name for God, saying, I had been in conference with the great master workman, the Lord himself, and I have secret information. And so, if we talk to our Masonic friends about the temple and its meaning, and about being good Masons, and about the Great Pyramid, which is the very emblem they use, and what the Great Pyramid signifies, our Masonic friends are astonished. We are going to discuss free and accepted Masonry, the Bible Masonry, my dear friends. In both those quotations, his Masonic friends seem surprised that Charles Russell knows the same information they do. This goes further when Russell says, you know our order is so secret we cannot know each other always. Is that not wonderful? I find that it is so with Masons also. Many Masons shake hands with me and give me what I know is their grip. They don't know me from a Mason. Something I do seems to be the same as Masons do. I don't know what it is, but they often give me all kinds of grips and I give them back. Then I tell them I don't know anything about it except just a few grips that have come to me naturally. Russell seems to be saying that somehow he knows about Freemasonry, but he doesn't know how he knows. It just comes naturally to him. But he then goes on to say that he, in fact, knows more about occult things than Freemasons themselves do. Do our Masonic friends understand something about the temple and being Knights Templar and so on? We more. This next quotation from that discourse is very telling indeed. Blessed are your eyes, for they see. Not everybody has the hearing ear and the seeing eye. It is only those who have come into this divine Masonry that have the spiritual insight and the spiritual guidance, and may know the things that are freely given to us. It is something that is freely given to one class and not intended for anyone else. Russell therefore had no problems in his followers joining Masonry, saying, if you feel that you want to become a member of the free and accepted order of Masonry, and do not feel free and Masonic enough as a follower of Christ, God bless you. Use your own judgment. That is yours to decide, not mine. Finally, he said, so you and I, as under Masons, are waiting for the return of the Master Mason. Therefore, we are unsurprised when we find this winged sun disk symbol, which was prevalent on early Watchtower publications. Here we also see it on their Kingdom Hall in Queens, New York. I'm led to believe that this too has recently been taken down, as it was starting to cause too much controversy. Early issues of the Watchtower had this front cover, which has a bit of sun symbolism, although nothing especially incriminating. The watchtower with the illuminating light coming from the top also hints at the old Babylonian tower theme, but it's presented as a kind of lighthouse rather than a ziggurat. This seems to me to be the subtlety of the Jehovah's Witnesses. It's like Russell was constantly hinting at occult ideas and dancing around them, but disguising them or distancing himself just enough for them to avoid incrimination. Further research will tell you that the other symbols here, particularly the cross and crown, may have deeper meanings, but because they're not connected to anything I've covered so far, I'll bypass them and leave you to do your own investigation there. The whole Jehovah's Witnesses organization are controlled by a governing body of 10 to 15 mature men, who they believe receive direct guidance from the spiritual realm. The governing body then instructs the followers through the pages of the Watchtower publications, and these decrees are enforced by elders within local assemblies. We're basically talking about a power hierarchy here, where those at the top claim spiritual authority to enforce their temporal authority. Jehovah's Witnesses are taught that Scripture alone is insufficient to understand the things of God, and that they need the teachings of the governing body, as passed down through the Watchtower, to properly understand the Bible. They say, Jehovah God has also provided his visible organization, his faithful and discreet slave, made up of spirit-anointed ones. Unless we are in touch with this channel of communication that God is using, we will not progress along the road to life, no matter how much Bible reading we do. They teach that people are not to think for themselves, but are to rely upon this hierarchy for true knowledge, saying, but a spirit of independent thinking does not prevail in God's organization, and we have sound reasons for confidence in the men taking the lead among us. There are similarities here to the Catholic Church and all the pagan hierarchies, in that they try to keep control by teaching their followers to develop a dependency on the hierarchy for truth, and not to think for themselves. Also, like Catholicism, they strengthen that control by saying that if anyone goes against their teaching, they will be removed from the fellowship and therefore will lose their salvation. The use of guilt and fear to control the followers is enough to keep them towing the party line. Anyone who has tried to leave will know how controlling an organization it really is. Jehovah's Witnesses are also expected to spy on one another and report any misdemeanors to the elders. If they don't, they run the risk of being disfellowshipped themselves. People can be disfellowshipped for such things as speaking to a disfellowshipped person and reading material that hasn't been approved by the governing body. So in that we see the same old attempts to keep a firm grip on the information flows. Those information flows say that Jesus Christ is not God. Jesus Christ is a created being. The Archangel Michael is a god. That Christ's body was not resurrected, and that the Christian Church is not preaching the gospel. Why do the Jehovah's Witnesses have so many doctrines that are in common with the doctrines of demons? Well, as I mentioned, their governing body believes it is experiencing direction from the spiritual realm. They believe that direction to be angelic. Vindication, Volume 3 says, the heavenly messengers are angels of the Lord, now used by the Lord in behalf of the remnant. These angels are invisible to human eyes and are there to carry out the orders of the Lord. No doubt they first hear the instruction which the Lord issues to his remnant, and then these invisible messengers pass such instruction on to the remnant. Raymond Franz, an ex-member of the governing body, confirmed in his book, Crisis of Conscience, that they made decisions not on the Bible or by prayer, but by this angelic direction. They claim these angels also direct the writing of the Watchtower magazine. The Lord used the Watchtower to announce these truths. Doubtless he used his invisible deputies to have much to do with it. On top of this, they practiced necromancy, communication with the dead, as they claimed that Charles Russell continued to contact them after death to guide the organization. Though Pastor Russell has passed beyond the veil, he is still managing every feature of the harvest work. We hold that he supervises, by the Lord's arrangement, the work yet to be done. Also, Hence our dear pastor, now in glory, is without doubt manifesting a keen interest in the harvest work, and is permitted by the Lord to exercise some strong influence thereupon. The Watchtower has made numerous false prophecies and set wrong dates that have come and gone. They have mistranslated the Bible, endorsed things like numerology, spiritism, necromancy, astrology, and masonry. Clearly, whatever they are in contact with is not from God. Finally, this is a close-up of the inscription on Charles Taze Russell's grave. You may be surprised to see what kind of shape this grave takes. What is also significant is that there's a building in the background, and if we were to walk down the slope to the foot of the flagpole, we would see this. This is the Greater Pittsburgh Masonic Center. I need to keep repeating that no human beings are our enemies, and that these individual organizations are not our enemies. Keep looking beyond the princes of Tyre to see the King of Tyre. Our enemies are spiritual, not physical. The emerging philosophy goes even further than ecumenism with Rome, however. Because they adhere to the idea that truth is unknowable, they don't agree that they are the light of the world that needs to shine in the darkness. Instead, they believe in entering into conversation with other religions on equal terms. Brian McLaren writes, "Ultimately, I hope Jesus will save Buddhism, Islam, and every other religion, including the Christian religion, which often seems to need saving about as much as any other religion does." He also says, "I must add, though, that I don't believe making disciples must equal making adherents to the Christian religion. It may be advisable in many, not all circumstances to help people become followers of Jesus and remain with their Buddhist, Hindu, or Jewish contexts." In the following quote, he also places Jesus on a level with Muhammad, saying, "And during his lifetime, Abraham, like Moses, Jesus, and Muhammad, had an encounter with God that distinguished him from his contemporaries and propelled him into a mission, introducing a new way of life that changed the world. How appropriate that the three Abrahamic religions begin with a journey into the unknown." We have seen that Muhammad did have an encounter with something, but it wasn't God, and that Islam does not stem from the same Abrahamic root as Judeo-Christianity. But what McLaren is leaning towards in these quotes is in fact universalism, the idea that you can find God through any religion. Spencer Burke agrees, saying, "When I say I'm a universalist, what I really mean is that I don't believe you have to convert to any particular religion to find God. As I see it, God finds us, and it has nothing to do with subscribing to any particular religious view." The May-June 2000 issue of Watchman's Trumpet magazine elaborates on what this means. Messianic Muslims, who continue to read the Quran, visit the mosque and say their daily prayers but accept Christ as their saviour, are the products of the strategy which is being tried in several countries. They continued a life of following the Islamic requirements, including mosque attendance, fasting, and Quranic reading, besides getting together as a fellowship of Muslims who acknowledge Christ as the source of God's mercy for them. Mike Oppenheimer of Let Us Reason Ministries has done some research on how this new idea of missions works out. He says something very telling. Can a Christian now call himself a Muslim? The word Muslim is made up of two words, Islam and Mu. Muslim does not just mean submission, it means submission to the God Allah, not the Lord Jesus Christ or Yahweh. Can a Muslim be called a Christian and walk with Allah? This seems to make no doctrinal or practical sense, unless they change the names and the meaning. This only brings confusion. Why do this when you can introduce Yahweh as the true God without any baggage and shuffling around in names, nature, or description? The answer is that you may not see the same results. This is what this is all about, isn't it? Results. Pragmatism. The end justifies the means. There's that phrase again. The end justifies the means. Do anything to get the required results. It's the occult way. And remember, this is what the Catholic Church did in pagan Rome. They basically said, keep your paganism, but let's just change some names and try to throw Jesus into the mix. All that they introduced was paganism with a Christian mask. But what fellowship can light have with darkness? Rob Bell recently published his book, Love Wins, in which he speculates in his uniquely non-committal, hypothetical, fuzzy, wishy-washy, self-contradictory way that in the end everyone will reach heaven. He says, "People come to Jesus in all sorts of ways. Sometimes people use his name, other times they don't." Acts 4:12 contradicts Bell, saying, "There is salvation in no one else. God has given no other name under heaven by which we must be saved." Here are some other quotes from emerging church leaders in favor of this idea that people don't need to change their faith in order to attain heaven. Firstly, Leonard Sweet says, "New Light embodiment means to be in connection and information with other faiths. One can be a faithful disciple of Jesus Christ without denying the flickers of the sacred and followers of Yahweh or Kali or Krishna." Rick Warren says, "I happen to know people who are followers of Christ in other religions." Peter Kreeft says, "Allah is not another God. We worship the same God. The same God, the very same God we worship in Christ, is the God of the Jews and the Muslims." Alice Bailey says the same thing. "I would point out that when I use the phrase followers of the Christ, I refer to all those who love their fellow men, irrespective of creed or religion." Can we see how closely the words and ideas of the emerging church movement mimic those of occultists? Alice Bailey also says, "The reason he has not come again is that the needed work has not been done by his followers in all countries. His coming is largely dependent, as we shall later see, upon the establishing of right human relations. The Church has hindered and is not helped because of its fanatical zeal to make Christians of all peoples and not followers of Christ. It has emphasized theological doctrine and not love." So the problem is that we have been emphasizing truth too much. The emerging church agrees. Notice also here that Bailey makes a distinction between the term Christian and Christ follower. The emerging movement has encouraged us to drop the term Christian in favor of Christ follower, which is a looser term. Remember, many people followed Jesus around Israel when he preached, but not all that followed accepted his claim to be God. Many of those that followed were in fact Pharisees. Following from a distance is not enough. We were bought with his blood and are now slaves to Christ, nothing less. Here Bailey also alludes to the fact that we have been the barrier to the coming of the Antichrist because of our uncompromising determination to see that people hear about the gospel truth and become Christians. The emerging church follows the advice of the occultists like Bailey, however, and instead of giving people the truth, they tell them that they can keep whatever religion they have, but just add Christ. But which Christ is it? The Christ of ecumenism with Rome and with Babylon is not the Christian Christ. Emerging church leader Erwin McManus wrote, "My goal is to destroy Christianity as a world religion and be a recatalyst for the movement of Jesus Christ. Some people are upset with me because it sounds like I'm anti-Christian. I think they might be right." Of course, you cannot be in relationship with the Christ of the Bible while simultaneously remaining in the confines of a false religion rooted in Babylon, worshipping satanic idols and believing in doctrines of demons. You must leave that religion completely and give your life to Jesus, not just add him on. The kingdom of light has no partnership with the kingdom of darkness. The only Christ that you can be in relationship with under this system is the false Jesus, the false Christ, the one spoken about by Alice Bailey, the Antichrist. The emergent church are duping people into believing they are saved as a Buddhist or Muslim just because they have tacked a false Christ onto the end. So when emergents talk about bridging the gap to non-Christians, they aren't talking about reaching them with the pure gospel, they are talking about compromise. Leonard Sweet explains, "The key to navigating post-modernity's choppy, crazy waters is not to seek some balance or safe middle ground, but to ride the waves and bridge the opposites, especially where they converge in reconciliation and illumination." Followers of the emergent ideal, therefore, take the approach that to reach the world you have to immerse yourself in the world, to enjoy the things the world enjoys, to go to the places the world goes, to indulge in popular culture. What we find in these churches is that the world is coming into the church rather than the church going into the world. People involved in the emerging movement have to ask themselves, who is evangelizing who here? We have been instructed to be in the world, but in no sense of the world. It is impossible to immerse yourself in an ever more polluted culture and not be affected. We will become deceived with the standards of the world unless we keep ourselves holy before God. Finally, because the emerging church believes that doctrinal truth is essentially unknowable, the only real substance they believe Christianity has to offer the world is found in social action or social justice. If it's arrogant of Christians to claim that we have the one and only route to everlasting life, and we can't offer hope for eternal salvation with certainty, and if everyone's going to be saved through their own faiths anyway by just tacking Christ onto the end, they assume that will take care of itself, and instead their ultimate goal becomes making the world a better place. They believe in the same man-made utopian ideal long held by occultists, and think that paradise can be achieved here on earth by social activism, and that is all Christians really have to offer the world. The deception here is particularly powerful because, of course, Christians should be doing all those things. They should be feeding the hungry and giving to the poor. But the underlying philosophy behind these actions for the emerging church is that we can build God's kingdom ourselves, and that we are in the process of evolving towards a utopian society that abolishes true faith in Christ and which joins hands with the Babylonian religion. The kingdom that man makes on this earth will be the Antichrist kingdom. We know that. The Bible tells us clearly. We've heard Alice Bailey talking about creating the perfect conditions for the return of their Christ by all the religions abandoning Christianity and coming together under one system. What I hope I've done is show how the emerging movement is playing its role in drawing Christians into that, with powerfully deceptive lies that are mixed with truth. Before we end the emerging church section, I should also point out that the idea of man establishing a utopia before Christ returns fits in with a theory that Christians call post-millennialism. I don't like using theological jargon, but it basically means that we'll create God's kingdom which rules the world peacefully for 1,000 years, and then Jesus will return at the end of those 1,000 years. The opposite view is called premillennialism, and this is the idea that Jesus will come back and himself will establish his own kingdom, which will usher in a 1,000-year period of peace. As you can see, Christians who hold to the post-millennialism view, the idea that we can create world peace ourselves, may, and I emphasize the word may, be at risk of being drawn into the pagan attempts to build a man-made utopia. I believe it is clearly the biblical stance that Jesus will establish his own kingdom prior to the millennial reign. Our job between now and his return is simply to make sure that as many as possible will be ready to meet him as their Lord and Saviour when he comes.
In the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 32, verse 35, it says, "Their foot shall slip in due time." In this verse, God threatens his vengeance on the wicked and unbelieving Israelites. Under all the cultivations of heaven, they brought forth bitter and poisonous fruit. The expression I have chosen for my text, "their foot shall slip," implies no matter how careful the unbelieving are, they shall slip into death and fall into the pit of hell. They were always exposed to this destruction, as one who walks in slippery places is exposed to fall. In Psalms 73, verse 18, it says, "Surely thou didst set them in slippery places, that thou castest them down into destruction." It implies that they were always exposed to sudden and unexpected destruction, as he that walks in slippery places is at every moment liable to fall. He cannot foresee the moment when he will slip, but when he does, he falls all at once and without warning, which is also expressed in Psalms 73, verse 18. Oh, how they are brought to destruction as in a moment. Another thing that is implied is that they're liable to fall of themselves without being thrown down by the hand of another. Somebody who stands or walks on slippery grounds needs nothing but his own weight to throw him down. The reason sinners have not fallen already and do not fall now is that it is not God's appointed time. But one day, everybody's time will come, and when it does, their foot shall slip. God will not hold them up in these slippery places any longer, but he will let them go. And at that very instant, they'll fall. They will fall into death and destruction. There is nothing that keeps a wicked man from dying and going to hell this very second, except the mere patience of God. He is not only able to cast wicked man into hell, but he can do it most easily. We find it easy to step on and crush a worm. In the same way, it is easier for God, when he pleases, to cast his enemies down to hell. Foolish people say there is no God, but when their foot slips, in an instant they will find themselves standing before God, and they'll tremble in fear. And when that divine moment comes, God's justice will call out loud for an infinite punishment for their sins. Doubtless there are great numbers of people who do not fear hell, but are now at ease, unaware that they will be made nothing more but object of God's wrath. The reason they do not slip and go to hell this very moment is because God is restraining himself. But the wrath of God burns against them. Their damnation does not slumber. The pit of hell is prepared. The fire is burning. The furnace is now hot. The pit of hell has opened his mouth. The devil stands ready to receive them. They belong to him. He possesses their souls. The demons watch like greedy, hungry lions that see their prey. But for the present time, God holds back. And when God should withdraw his hand, they will be cast into hell in a moment, and Satan will be waiting there to devour their souls. Yet, many people shrug off this reality as nonsense. They go on believing that there is no God, when it is God that is the very one holding them up from this misery. Hell is exceedingly violent in nature. The pains and torment of hell are even greater than what people can imagine. It is no security to wicked man for one moment that there is no visible death for him right now. It is no security for man that he is now in good health, that he does not see which way he will imminently go, maybe by some accident. There is no visible danger for him at this present time. But eternity is waiting. They never know which step they may lose balance and slip. It could be the very next step you take. God has so many different ways of taking a wicked man out of this world and sending them to hell that he needs no miracle. He needs nothing out of the ordinary to provide this destruction. Natural man takes great care in the preservation of his own life. Knowing one day everybody dies, they fool themselves and imagine that they have plenty of time with nothing to worry about. Ecclesiastes chapter 2, verse 16 says, "How dieth the wise man, even as the fool? All wicked men contrive his plans in which way they will attempt to escape hell, while they continue to reject Christ." Almost every natural man hears of hell and flatters himself that he will escape it. He reassures himself in what he has done, what he is now doing, or what he intends to do. Everybody plays out matters in their own mind, how they will avoid damnation. They think if hell exists, they'll be kept out. And they deceive themselves that they are undeserving of hell. Even though they did not repent of their sins, they convince themselves that they are good people. They do not intend to go to hell. They say to themselves, "I intend to take effectual care and not to fall." But the foolish children of man miserably delude themselves in their own schemes, confident in their own strength and wisdom. They trust in nothing but an empty shadow. The majority of those people who have convinced themselves of these same lies are now dead, and undoubtedly gone to hell. And if we could ask them, inquire from them one by one whether or not they expected to be subjects of this misery, they would undoubtedly reply,
"No, I never intended to come here. I had laid out matters otherwise. I thought I had contrived well for myself, but death overcame me unexpectedly. I didn't look for it at that time, but death outwitted me. God's wrath was too quick for me."
So whatever people have imagined and pretend death is going to be like, they will only pass into death to discover that the one true God has his wrath set against them, and it will be the worst truth they ever face. They will tremble in fear and be terrified, realizing that they did never believe. And now it's too late. Demons are waiting to devour their souls. Hell is gaping for them. The fire is lit. The flames are burning. Their doom is coming for them. The brimstone is hot. It is prepared for them. The dreadful pit of hell is glowing. The wrath of God is raging. Hell is right under your feet, and you have nothing to stand up on. You have nothing to take hold of. There's nothing between you and hell but the thin air. You probably are not aware of how God keeps you out of hell. People do not see his hand in it, but you look at other things, such as the state of health that you are in, and the means you use to preserve yourself. But indeed, these things are nothing. When God chooses to withdraw his hand, there will be nothing more to keep you from falling than the thin air you are suspended in. Your sins make you as heavy as lead. They are pulling you down with great force towards hell, and when God should let go, you will immediately sink swiftly. God holds you over the pit of hell like a disgusting insect over the fire and is dreadfully provoked. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast in the fire. You are 10 times more detestable in his eyes than the most hated venomous serpent. You have offended him infinitely. You are not guaranteed one single day of life. In fact, you may lay down to sleep and never open your eyes again. The only reason that you have been given the opportunity to wake up and don't drop dead into hell at this very moment is because the mere mercy of God. O sinner, consider the danger you are in. It is a great furnace of wrath, a wide and bottomless pit that you are held over. In the hand of God you are hanging by a slender thread, with the flames of divine wrath flashing about. It is the wrath of the infinite God. If only it were the wrath of man, it might be endurable. But man's wrath is nothing compared to the inconceivable anger of God. God's wrath exceeds any imaginable punishment you can suffer on earth. Hell will be so relentlessly painful and torturous that you cannot even conceive what it will be like. Ezekiel chapter 8 verse 18 says, "There I will also deal in fury. My eyes shall not spare, neither shall I have pity. And though they cry in my ears with a loud voice, yet I will not hear them." Those words are exceedingly terrible. Consider this. God will inflict unbearable pain upon your soul without any pity. When God sees your extreme suffering and torment to be so vastly disproportionate to your strength, he will have no compassion for you. He will not withdraw the execution of his wrath, or at the least bit be merciful. If you cry, God will not have any regard for your welfare. Though he will know you cannot bear the pain, he will only trample on you all the more. He will crush you under his feet. He will crush out your blood and make it fly. He will stomp on your dead corpse until the blood splatters out onto his garments. The extreme punishment and misery that you will be exposed to, that God will inflict on you, will have no end. He will show the angels and man how excellent his judgment is. Isaiah 66 verse 23 through 24 says, "And they shall go forth and look upon the carcasses of the men that have transgressed against me, and for their worm shall not die, neither shall their fire be quenched." It is an everlasting punishment. It will be dreadful to suffer that agony only for one moment, but you must suffer it for all eternity. There will be no end to this exquisite, horrible misery. You will look forward and see a long forever, a boundless duration of time, which will swallow up your thoughts and amaze your soul. And when you absolutely can't bear it anymore, forever, nothing but disparity. All hope will lost. Nothing there to rescue you. You must wear out long ages, millions of years of infliction beyond what you can withstand. And after you bear this punishment for centuries and centuries, you will realize that it hasn't even been 1 second. Some people may now be at ease. They may hear all these things and not be disturbed. They are now flattering themselves that they are not the persons which are subject to these promises. Oh, how awful it would be for those people. Their damnation does not slumber. It will come swiftly and in most all probability suddenly upon many of you. You may deserve hell more than some of the people who are already there now. But their time has passed. All hope is lost for them. But here you are in the land of the living, in the house of God. You have the opportunity to obtain salvation. Oh, what those poor, helpless souls wouldn't give for a day's opportunity as you now enjoy. At this time, God stands ready to pity you. In this day, a day of mercy, you may cry out with some encouragement of obtaining mercy. But when the day of mercy has passed, your cries will be in vain. You will be completely helpless. But right now, at this very moment, you have an extraordinary opportunity. A day where Christ has thrown the door of mercy wide open and stands calling and crying with a loud voice. He's knocking on the door. He's eager to forgive you. At this time, you can be sanctified. You could be washed of your sins, and you could rejoice in the treasures of heaven. You can take part in the glory of God. Beg for his forgiveness now before it's too late. Repent of your sins and obtain the rewards of heaven. So in Genesis chapter 3 verse 21, God makes the first blood sacrifice. God had to make clothing out of animal skins to cover Adam and Eve's nakedness. And also because their sin had cursed the earth, he knew that winter would eventually come, and so he had to provide warmth for them. The symbolism is a living blood sacrifice. It's the cost to cover sin. Right after that in Genesis chapter 3 verse 15, God makes his first promise of the Messiah and the first prophecy of crucifixion. He said to the serpent, I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you shall strike his heel. So the woman's offspring represents Israel, and Jesus' mother, Miriam. Through the bloodline of the Jews, the Messiah would be born. A woman in Scripture refers to Israel, God's wife, and the Christian church is the bride of Christ, a woman. In this passage, it uses the word he. He will crush your head. Jesus is the male. He is the masculine figure that this is referring to. There's two bloodlines mentioned here, but because of time restraint, I'll elaborate more on the other one in a separate lesson. So how is this a prophecy of crucifixion? Well, there's a double meaning here. The term, he shall bruise his heel, is a reference to crucifixion, but stomping down on the serpent's head is a metaphor for what could cause a bruise on the heel. In 1968, while excavating, archaeologists discovered the remains of a victim who had been crucified, and that discovery has become known as the Jehoiakim bone. This discovery proves that the nails for crucifixion was driven through the heel bone. Hence, the biblical description, he shall bruise his heel. And yes, this prophecy was before the invention of crucifixion because it was a Roman practice. In Genesis chapter 12, God calls on Abram to begin fulfilling his promise that he made to Adam. God's plan was to start a genetic bloodline of people that the Messiah would be born from. And even though Abraham's wife Sarah was childbearing, she would still miraculously conceive and give birth to Isaac. This childbearing status was a foreshadowing of the virgin birth of Jesus. Abraham had two sons. Muslims will claim that it was Ishmael who was the chosen son, but they fail to understand that Isaac was born a miraculous birth and Ishmael was born in the natural way. So they have no legitimate claim to their false religion. In Genesis chapter 22 verse 2, God commands Abraham to sacrifice his son on an altar to the Lord. This verse symbolizes that Jesus is God's son and that God was willing to sacrifice his own son just so that people could have forgiveness for sins. In Exodus chapter 11, God declares he's going to strike dead every firstborn son in Egypt. So in Exodus chapter 12 verse 7, God said to put the blood of a lamb over the doorway and the angel of death would pass over, sparing the Hebrew children from death. This was the first Passover, and it is a representation of the blood of Jesus. If we have the blood of Jesus, God will spare us from eternal death. Then after the Hebrews were wandering in the desert, they were commanded to build a tabernacle, which housed the Ark of the Covenant. Inside of the Ark of the Covenant was 2 tablets with the 10 Commandments. Earlier, when Moses saw the people worshiping false gods, he got angry and he broke the 10 Commandments into pieces. Breaking the 2 tablets is symbolism of breaking the law. On the Day of Atonement, the high priest would sprinkle the blood of a lamb onto the cherubim that sat on the lid of the Ark of the Covenant. This symbolizes the blood covers the broken law. The Hebrews were divided into 12 tribes. They were systematically positioned in the formation of a giant cross marching through the desert. Can you imagine 600,000 people synchronized to the shape of a giant cross marching through the desert? If you've ever watched a military parade or synchronized swimming, you can get an idea. Then in Psalms 22 verse 16, King David talks about a band of evil men have encircled me. They have pierced my hands and feet. King David wasn't talking about himself. He was prophesying that the Messiah would be crucified. He uses the term pierced hands and feet. And in Psalms chapter 22 verse 1, King David sings, my God, why have you forsaken me? And down in verse 14, he begins to describe, all my bones are out of joint. This is describing crucifixion. The person who is nailed to the cross is pulled down by their own weight, causing their muscles and shoulders to rip and the joints to dislocate. In the New Testament, it was the feast of the Passover when Jesus was crucified. But what are the chances of that? The Pharisees tried to have him killed several times and never succeeded until the day of the Passover. Jesus could have been stoned to death, he could have been beheaded or hung, but he was crucified, just as the Bible predicted. The Pharisees had no control over the method of death because it was Pontius Pilate who ordered the sentence, which is a Roman practice. So he was born in Bethlehem just at the right time. He was a direct descendant of King David. He went to Egypt as a child. He died died by crucifixion just on the right day. I wonder how he pulled all that off, just to volunteer himself to be nailed to a cross, with absolutely nothing to gain. The whole concept of the Messiah is that Jesus was the sacrificial Lamb of God. Not too many people would volunteer themselves to do that job, nor could they, because they were not God's son without sin. In Matthew 27, verse 46, it says, Jesus cried out, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani. You ever wonder why the rest of the Gospels are all written in Greek, and only that one part was in Aramaic? Because in verse 37 it says, when some of the people standing there heard this, they said, he's calling to Elijah. So Matthew was explaining to a Greek audience that in Aramaic, Eloi, Eloi sounds like Elijah, Elijah. So why would the people think that he was calling on Elijah? Turn to the Old Testament, to the book of Malachi, chapter 4, verse 6 through 5. It says, see, I will send you the prophet Elijah before that great and dreadful day of the Lord comes. So what is the day of the Lord? Acts chapter 2, verse 20 says, the sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood before the coming of the great and glorious day of the Lord. So the people were waiting for Elijah as a sign to Jesus' first coming, but the day of the Lord is an end-time prophecy referring to his second coming. Instead, they should have been looking for John the Baptist. So what was so special about Elijah? In 2 Kings chapter 2, verse 11, it says, suddenly a chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared, and separating the two of them, and Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind. Elijah never died. He was raptured. Know anybody else who was raptured? That's right, Enoch. Enoch was the seventh from Adam. There we have that number again, 7. In Genesis chapter 5, verse 21, Enoch walked with God, and then he was no more because God took him away. Let's take a look at Revelation 6:12. And behold, when he had opened the sixth seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake, and the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood. Now in chapter 11, verse 3, it says, and I will give power to my 2 witnesses, and they will prophesy for 1,260 days, clothed in sackcloth. So there was 2 tablets of Moses, 2 fish, there's 2 testaments, 2 groups of people, the Jews and the Gentiles, the wife of God, the bride of Christ, and 2 witnesses. Have any ideas on who the 2 witnesses may be? Does Elijah and Enoch ring a bell? They were both raptured. It says in Revelations chapter 11, verse 7 through 8, when they have finished their testimony, the beast that comes up from the abyss will attack them and overpower them and kill them, and their bodies will lie in the public square of the great city. It's talking about 2 actual people because it describes their bodies. In chapter 11, verse 9, it says, for 3.5 days man from every people, tribe, language, and nation will gaze upon their bodies. This is a prophecy of technology that had not been invented yet, because how could the entire world see this event at once? We have the invention of cell phones, cameras, satellites, and television with news channels. Take all these things into consideration. How from the beginning could the Bible prophets predict all of these things and Jesus carry it all out if it were not the inspired word of God? People feel like their prayers aren't answered? Well, guess what? Jesus prayed until he sweat blood, a man who had never committed a sin, and God didn't answer his prayer, just so that you could be forgiven. Hope you enjoyed today's message. Tune in next time. Goodbye.
Talking about God. The show, or I'm going to talk about God. And to do it, I'll be using the symbolic book, also known as the Bible. I'm going to be teaching a theology which focuses around the symbolism in the Bible. Deeply embedded into the scriptures are symbols of which I want to help teach you how to interpret, so that you'll have a better understanding of God. Let's get started. The Bible was written in 2 major categories. The 2 divisions of the Bible are the Old Testament and the New Testament. We mark these dates on our calendar as being B, C, and A.D. This is to say, before Christ, and then after death. There's a saying to familiarize yourself with, and in the doctrine that I'll be teaching, this saying is going to be very relevant to what we are going to learn. The Old Testament is God concealed, while the New Testament is God revealed. So, let's start in the beginning, Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. You can just read along with me. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And He separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and the darkness He called night. And there was morning and evening on the first day. So let's start with day 1. The formula for creation. Time. Force. And space. F-O-R-C-E. Matter. And energy. Here we have the formula for creation. In the beginning, that's time, God. He was the force. He created the heavens, is the space, and the earth. That's matter. The Spirit of God hovered over the waters, and He said, "Let there be light." That's energy. So that's the formula for existence. Now, our creation. Taking a careful look at the words chosen in the Bible, you will find have often double meanings and symbols. This Bible study is going to be focusing on the symbolism. And I want to start in the beginning and take you all the way through quickly and comprehensively. I'll be laying down this foundation that we're going to build on so that you can get an understanding of the theology that I'll be teaching. So the wording is very important. The Old Testament was written in Hebrew, a Semitic language that reads from right to left. We'll be reading the translation in English. Let's carefully take a look at the words. Now I wrote my entire lesson out here, and I want to show you guys. I wrote this handwritten, and this is just the outline that I'll be following throughout this lesson. But I intend to upload these videos to Facebook so that I can make them available for my friends to watch. Unfortunately, I'm only able to do 5-minute segments, or maybe a little longer, due to the time restrictions. So I'm going to be dividing my video up into segments, and this will also make it easier for my friends who want to watch this. Okay, so I'm back. So the wording that we were discussing in the chapter 1, verse 1 of Genesis is relevant. All the wording of the Bible is relevant, and when you actually break it down and then look at the original Hebrew and Greek, you find there's deeper meanings to all this. So I explained the formula of creation as being time, force, space, matter, energy. But God said, S-A-I-D. He said, "Let there be light," and it was so. So He, it became true. Because God said it. So there's power in God's Word. There's power in the Word, right? And what I like to call my Bible is the Word. I'll say I'm going to read the Word, right? So the Word. I want to highlight this because this is important. We'll be coming back to the Word. Now, in my first video, I explained that the Old Testament starts out with telling us of the beginning of time, and the New Testament tells us of the end of time. Likewise, the Old Testament starts out with God speaking us into existence with His Word, And then in the New Testament, in Revelation, he speaks Satan out of existence with the word of his mouth. So he speaks us in, and he speaks him out. Us make man in our image and in our likeness. And I want to stop there, and I want to break this down. So, God said to let us make man in our image. And this is in the plural form, in both senses of the word. So, he didn't say, let me make man in my image, is what he did not say. So the us and the are in plural, here, we're right back to that. And so what this is a doctrine of is a doctrine of the soul. So when God made us in his image, that is that we look like him in physical flesh, he also made us in his likeness, in the sense that we have a spiritual body or a soul. So I talked about the holy numerology, the biblical numbers. And 3 is one that I didn't discuss. So we're going to talk about the root meaning of 3. There's a lot of things in the Bible I'll be pointing out to you which are symbolized using numbers, and 3 is definitely a prominent one. So heaven has an S, making it plural. And so I've identified 3 heavens. And the 3 heavens are in the realm of heaven where God lives, the highest heaven above. And then the galaxies, so where the Spirit of God is. And then Jesus walked, and I'm not a good artist, to do a stick figure. Jesus walked on earth. So 1, 2, and 3. So the number 3 represents the Trinity. That is to say, the Father, the Son, S-O-N, and then the Spirit, S-P-I-R-I-T. That's right, Spirit. So all 3 of these elements equal 1. So I want to introduce you to some of the biblical elements. And what some of those elements are going to be water and blood and fire. There's more, but I want to focus right now on water. So this is a biblical element, and interpreting the symbols of the Bible, our elements are going to be important. So we have water. Now water comes in 3 forms. You have water, you have ice, and steam. All 3 of these are one element, H2O. But H2O comes in 3 forms: liquid, solid, or vapor. So 3 elements, 3 forms, 1 substance. Likewise, God comes in 3 forms, but they all equal. The Father, the Son, and the Spirit all equal God. Thus, in the creation of the universe, God says, let us make man in our image. In verse number 15 is one of the most important verses in the entire Bible. The whole book itself is important, but this verse is specifically significant because the event that took place was that God created all of the universe and everything was going great. And when Satan crept in and possessed the serpent and man fell into the seduction, after that there was a disaster. So in verse 15, this is God saying that He is going to fix everything. He is going to restore it. So I'm going to read to you, and you can read along, chapter 3, verse 15. And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you shall strike his heel. So this verse is important because this is our very first promise of a Messiah. And it is our very first prophecy of crucifixion. And it goes on to talk about the seed of woman, which is also significant. This is something highly overlooked in a lot of today's theology. And when I get into the book of Revelation, this is going to come up again. And it's going to play a pretty big role in all of this. So I'm going to break this down. We have the seed of woman. And in this translation it says the offspring. So through the family bloodline, and I have the this family bloodline, this chart right here. Through Adam and Eve, and we call this Mother Nature and Father Time. And so mother is birthing. That's why it's Mother Nature, is she brings life through birth. So throughout the seed of woman eventually would be Abraham. And Abraham is the father of all Jews. And from that bloodline would come the Messiah. The seed of woman. Now, the seed of woman also represents Israel. Israel is identified as a woman in the feminine. And furthermore, in the New Testament, the followers of Jesus are also in the feminine as being the bride. And so this woman, Israel, and this bride of Christ is what God is referring to in this verse. This is our promise. Now, also the virgin Miriam. Through the Virgin Miriam, Jesus would be born. So the seed of woman. Now, when we look at this, through the Virgin Mary, here we have this verse one more time. In 15, you can read, it says, "And I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers, and he will crush your head." So we have he in the masculine. So he equals Jesus, who we call Jesus today. Jesus. Jesus is the he who comes from the woman, the seed of woman. And what it says is going to happen is that he will crush your head. Ultimately, the serpent becomes a snake. Possibly a viper, but I'll make it like a cobra. Definitely a poisonous snake. And so anyone that knows about snakes will tell you that the way to kill a snake is you got to get it in its head. The snake's organs are pushed up, right? You can wound a snake in its body, but if you want to kill a snake, you get it in the head. So, the head is at the top. And as we discussed, the top is good. That's up. Now, the heel is at the bottom. The heel is down. So, Satan succeeds in injuring God's heel. But God succeeds in crushing Satan's head. crucifixion became a practice in Rome. So before the invention of this, it was prophesied. So we have the serpent. And I'm sure this doesn't really look like a very good drawing because I'm not a very good artist. We have the serpent, the snake. And I'm going to draw a foot. That's a very cartoonish looking photo, but let's pretend it looks like a foot. It's supposed to be a foot right here. So as the foot crushes the serpent and it strikes his heel, we get our first prophecy of crucifixion. Crucifixion is practiced by driving a nail through the heel bone. And crucifixion will be prophesied throughout the Old Testament before the invention of it. So, to explain a little better, I have this visual guide to the Bible, and these archaeologists that were excavating some ancient tombs found these artifacts, and this one is a crucifixion nail. But over here on this side of the page, we have the heel bone of a man who was actually crucified, and the nail still remains, and it is driven through the heel on the cross, and you can see how his feet are straddled to the cross. Now, these people actually lived in a time where they would have witnessed crucifixion, so they know what a cross looks like, and they know how this works. We have the cross inaccurately. The nail was driven through the heel. I've been reading from the book of Genesis, which tells us the story of creation. And Adam is the first man. So he was placed into the Garden of Eden, which is the perfect environment. But Adam was never a baby, and he didn't have a childhood. He was created an adult male. He was a pre-aged, fully formed, and totally mature man from day one, a direct creation of God. And so what goes on to happen is God will take one of Adam's ribs, and he will make Eve, who becomes Adam's wife. And as I go through these lessons, I'm going to be paralleling between the Old and New Testament, because when you read the stories themselves are significant, but underneath the stories is a deeper rooted message. So let's take a look at this event, and we'll see what we have. Okay, we have Adam, who was created a miracle birth. Adam, the miracle birth, because he was never born. And then God will take one of Adam's ribs and make Eve, who is Adam's wife. And so Adam and Eve will go on to eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And then all sin enters the world through them. So now let's take a look at Jesus and compare the two. We have Jesus, who was born the virgin birth. And ultimately, Jesus will be crucified. And one of the things they did to Jesus when they crucified him was they pierced him in his side. And that's where the rib is located. And so the Bible tells us that water and blood flowed out of his side when he was pierced. And so these are our two elements. And in interpreting the symbols of the Bible, these two elements are important, and these will be mentioned a lot, water and blood. But because of the blood, this makes salvation possible. And the people who, or the followers of Jesus, are known as the bride. The bride of Christ. And so because Jesus died on the cross, This made it possible for forgiveness of sins. F-O-R-G-I-V. God forgives sins because Jesus died on the cross. So now let's just take a look at the two. We have Adam, who was born a miracle birth, and from his rib came his wife. And then all sin enters the world through Adam. Now we have Jesus, who was born a miracle birth, and he was pierced in his side. Blood flows out, which gives him his bride. And then all sin is forgiven through Jesus. So you can see the parallel between the two. When we read the story of Jesus about how he's crucified and about how he's pierced in his side, and we hear about the bride of Christ, we think, well, those are good stories. But predestination, prophecy in the Old Testament is very relevant in this story, because the first Adam is the one who sins, and Jesus is the one who forgives. He said, look at the evolutionists. They say, did God really create the earth? Well, if God even exists. So our comes from the word for the Egyptian sun god Horus. And the Egyptian sun god had an enemy, sort of a Satan, but they called him Set. And every day, when the sun went down, Set would conquer the sun. And we call this today a sunset. And there are 7 visible planets without using a telescope. 7 visible planets. And our Earth will orbit around and have several different eclipses, but it will pass through 12 different constellations in the sky. Or 12 zodiac signs that Earth will pass through. So there are approximately 30 days equal a moon, or what we call month. The word moon is the original origin from our word month. It happened many, many moons ago. Now, from point A to point B, this orbit will take approximately 365 days, equal 1 year. And then we have the great year, which is known as an age. We live in this day and age. So let's take a look at our days of the week. We have Saturn Day, the day of the planet Saturn. Sun Day, the day of the sun. And then we have Moon Day, day of the moon, and so forth. 7 visible planets. We call this Saturday, Sunday, and Monday. Dun, 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 dun. Salut! Comment allez-vous? Moi? Très bien, merci. Va-ta place bonne. Qu'est-ce que tu fais, toi? Et pâtis-moi une bouteille de vin blanc, s'il vous plaît. Donnez-moi, mentez-moi ça.
Où se lave-t-on et moi? Lave-nous, lave-toi, amusez-vous. Woo!